Yeah, I am George Parks. I'm a lot like Kerry. When you work in the oil business for 30 years, you become direct. I remember when I first came to Nashville, walking in church, and they had this, the PowerPoint up, and it said, "Enjoy your coffee in the foyer." And see, in the oil business, we say, "Don't bring your coffee in this room." We're not too nice. I apologize if I'm not going to be real nice. I'm not going to be nice to some people, but we're going to go pretty fast. If I go too fast, speak up and let me know. I'm going to give you some warnings, some caveats, talk about a little bit about energy, what's going on in the current consumer market for vehicles, then talk about future fuels and vehicle technologies. And mostly I'll be talking about what LDVs, light duty vehicles. I'm not going to talk about trucks, big trucks. First rule, first warning, don't trust anybody. As an engineer, that's good advice, always. And I picked this, I saw this slide recently, and it fascinated me. And it's obviously people who are interested in solar, they said, what if solar got the same subsidies as fossil fuels? Fossil fuels, 72 billion, solar is 1 billion, okay? Now, I wasn't able to find out where they got those numbers. Looked for data, couldn't find it, couldn't find where they came from. How they presented, all this is interesting. So I went on. The Energy Information Administration publishes this data. Motley Fool a couple of years ago pulled the data out and said, okay, let's look at subsidies. And here's what you see. Again, the solar number actually is pretty good, 1.1. Fossil fuels down here, coal and oil and gas, add up to a little over $3 or $4 billion. So from 72 billion, we're down to about 4. Now, part of that is these numbers don't include credits or subsidies that are available to all industries. For instance, if there's a job creation credit on income tax for corporations, that's not included here. I'm sure it is up there. But anyway, you can see that these are still pretty big numbers, coal and oil and gas. So, and notice we're looking at total dollars. But there are other ways to look at numbers. There always are. So what if we look and say, okay, I'm interested in really on an equivalent energy basis. What do these resources get? In other words, per gallon of gasoline equivalent, per kilowatt hour, the numbers, and we'll look at it that way. But first, again, here's that chart, and here's with my numbers, okay? Or the EIA's numbers. But here's those same numbers. Whoops. Let's go on. Here are the numbers normal for total dollars, and here they are when expressed in terms of barrels of oil equivalent. Notice now we're at 28 cents on oil gas. Barrel of oil is 42 gallons. So this is, probably 3/4 cent per gallon. If we look in terms of energy, solar energy gets about $63 subsidies for producing the same amount of energy. So now, which is true? Well, they're both true. But depending on what I want you to think, I can present it this way. Or I can present it this way. Numbers don't lie, but liars use numbers, okay? So don't trust me, don't trust anybody. You have to, and the other thing, here's another example before we go on. Flex fuel vehicles, E85 capable vehicles. Why did automakers produce those? Answer number 1, to help the environment. Answer number 2, keep building gas guzzlers. And the answer is 2. There's a law called the CAFE law, the Corporate Average Fuel Economy, that says your fleet of vehicles for GM, Ford, whoever, has to attain a certain mile per gallon level in fuel economy. If it falls below that, you get fined for every vehicle you produce that year. Turns out there's a loophole in that law for flex fuel vehicles. If you spend $100 extra on your vehicle, turn it into a dual fuel vehicle, a 25 mile per gallon vehicle becomes a 40 mile per gallon vehicle. A 12 mile per gallon Chevy Suburban becomes a 20 mile per gallon Chevy Suburban. And by you're too young to remember, when flex fuel vehicles started, you saw Ford Expeditions, you saw Chevy Suburbans. You didn't see small cars getting this treatment. You saw the big gas guzzlers. So really, the reason GM did this was so they could keep making, and these are high profit vehicles. The big vehicles have high profit margins, and this is a loophole that allowed them to do that. So they're perfectly willing to spend that $100 a vehicle. Okay, there will be math. There's always math, and if you don't do it, you get fooled. And we'll give some examples of that later on. So I want to show, this is a great slide. The people at Lawrence Livermore put these together every year. This is really all the energy flows in the U.S. And notice it's in units of quads. Total is about 97 quads, so you can think of it as percent over here. So we've got solar up there at 0.3, hydro about 2.5, wind 1. But here are the big players. Natural gas 26, coal about 18, biomass actually pretty high, 4%, and finally petroleum at 35.1. That's where all our energy goes, or comes from. Now where it goes, interestingly enough, you can see over here, transportation. Notice that big green line comes straight over here to transportation. A little bit goes up here to industrial, commercial, residential, but then a bunch of it is wasted. That's energy that doesn't do useful work. So there are a lot of places we can improve, and that's one you always ought to focus on. Rejected energy, about 59% of what we bring in is rejected. Lots of opportunities there. It's not easy, but there are opportunities. So why do we care? Why should we change anything? First of all, oil is a finite resource. You may have seen what's called the Hubble curve. It says we're going to run out. I don't know when, but it's going to get, I don't know if we'll run out absolutely, but it gets harder and harder to produce. We go to deeper and deeper water, produce oil every year. Climate change. I don't know what you believe or don't believe about climate change, but the physics says one thing. More CO2 is higher temperatures. There may be compensatory measures like increased cloud cover. It costs more albedo and you reflect more sunlight. But that's basic. That's fundamental. You can take that to the bank. And also one I guess I forgot to put on here is energy security. Is another one. Okay. If you remember just one slide from the show, this is it from the presentation. Here we're looking at energy consumption. And I don't know what the units are here, but it's per capita energy consumption. In other words, how much does every person use? And over here we've got what's called the Human Development Index that the United Nations puts together. Uses things like economic factors, education, length of life, infant mortality. It says, how good is life in this place? And what you see is that if you don't have much energy, you're in a bad way. You have very low quality of life. As you come up here, they've drawn an arbitrary line at 0.7, and you can see a lot of the third world, the developing world that comes up here, and then you see up above 0.9 what we'd call the developed world. But the important thing about this slide is that there's a really high slope right here. But once you get out to about 4,000, whatever that is, or maybe even 3,000 on this chart, there's not much slope at all. In other words, having more energy doesn't make your life that much better. It doesn't increase your life expectancy. And for those of us who are out here, like Canada, the U.S., Iceland's a special case, and even though them, we can move back a lot this way without having a big impact on our quality of life. There's room for improvement without seriously impacting our lifestyles. What does that do when we move back there? We're dealing with a finite resource. These people desperately need it to move up this scale. And if we can use less, it makes it cheaper for them and easier for them to move up. Okay. And just so you know, I follow my own advice. I looked at that and I said, is that really true? And so I found the data myself. Yep, it's really true. Got it, threw it all in Excel and did my own. So anyway, always check, never trust. Okay, what do we pay for energy? Carrie's seen this slide before. These are just several energy carriers that we use. Gasoline. Here's the price of whatever unit that is. And then here I've normalized the price per 100,000 BTUs. And you can see gasoline, diesel, ethanol, heating oil, all similar around $2 to $3. Since electricity is made from other resources, it's going to be a little more expensive. Nat gas at what's called city gate price, only about 56 cents. And even at your, when it comes to your house, it's only about $1.71 per 100,000 BTUs. Real bargain. And coal, using the latest ton price I could find, only about 23 cents. So all these have different prices, and that the price and the final use dictates what which one you pick. It's easy to say we all want to pick coal, but it doesn't work for everything. And we pay a lot more than this sometimes. Hearing aid batteries. $7.20, this is off Amazon, $7.24 for 12 batteries. How much do you think that works out to per 100,000 BTUs? $2, we were saying $2 and $3. $152,000 for the same amount of energy as you get roughly from a gallon of gasoline or so. So we pay for energy. You wouldn't want to run around with a steam coal-fired generator on your back to power your hearing aid. So we pay more for energy when it's in very convenient forms to use. Okay, I'm going to talk basically about transportation. So let's talk about how transportation is really different in a lot of ways. We need high-density fuels. And I'll go into that more later. We want them easy to handle. We don't want to shovel coal into our cars when we pull up. We like taking that pump, putting liquid in. It's a real slow turnover. The average vehicle that's bought today will have a median life of at least, well, this goes back, this is 1990 vehicles, had a median life of 17 years. They're lasting longer every time. Also, you have this highly depreciated fuel infrastructure. Refineries are old. All the capital that went into those is depreciated. It's very difficult to compete against this huge infrastructure that's already in place. Also, transportation is the mobile pollution source. With a coal-fired electric plant, you can put scrubbers on, you can put all this equipment to capture the pollution. It's not that easy on a vehicle. The real miracle of vehicle cleanup was the three-way catalyst. I know you aren't chemists, but this is really almost a miraculous catalyst because it does two opposite reactions. It takes unburned hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide and it burns them to CO2 and water. But it takes some of this unburned hydrocarbon, reacts it with nitrous oxide or nitric oxides, their whole mix, and it reduces them to form nitrogen. That's really tough to do. That's why there's so much control on your exhaust to make sure that the mixture of gases leaving your cylinder is exactly stoichiometric, because you have to do both these chemistries in opposite directions at once. But when you get to greenhouse gases, there's no way that I know of, I don't think we'll ever capture CO2 coming out of an exhaust pipe. It's just too hard to do. There's too much of it. So transportation is fundamentally different due to its mobile nature, due to the fact that there are a lot of constraints. Fuel economy, we'll use two terms. I apologize for that, but they both get used a lot. Miles per gallon is what we're all used to. It goes back, I've been told, to the old days, early days of the automobile. You go buy a gallon of gasoline. And the question was, how far can I go on this? So we talked about miles per gallon. In Europe, we talk about fuel consumption, gallons per 100 miles. And this really describes better how we drive. We don't get in the car and say, I've got this much gasoline, how far can I go? We say, I'm going to the store and back, how much gasoline will I burn? And that's this number. But you'll see them both. Main thing to remember, if you're talking consumption, smaller is better. If we're talking miles per gallon, larger is better, okay? Gasoline, everybody asks about gasoline prices. Here's what they've done over the last 2 years. You see they've been between $3 and $4 a gallon. This is retail pump prices, average conventional and reformulated gas. The reformulated is a higher price because it's harder to make, okay? And if you live in California, you use reformulated gasoline. Most places don't. Anyway, so they've been fairly constant. And just always, flex fuels are interesting. E85, we talked about that. I went by Brentwood yesterday and looked at the station, and Brentwood was selling gasoline for $3.99. E85 was $2.99. If you look on a BTU basis and hold this price constant, you should be paying about $2.37 a gallon for E85. So the E85 is overpriced by about 26%. You pull into that station and you see $3.39 and $2.99.9, you say, well, that's a great deal, I'll buy this. Well, you're kind of getting ripped off in terms of dollars per BTU. Again, you have to do the math. Keep coming back to that, okay? And just an idea, gas prices, what comprises that price. Most of it is crude oil price, 40 or so cents on refining, distribution, pipeline, tanker, all that stuff with a little profit at each place. And then finally, the tax on the gallon is about 65 cents a gallon. This is California, so the tax is probably high. Also, the refining costs are high because it's reformulated gasoline. And I've spent all my life working here. And the frustration of working here is you have no control over this, and you have no control over that. So your managers are always beating on you. Do it cheaper, do it better. And it's not unusual for refining operations to have losing quarters or losing years where they actually lose money. The money to be made in the petroleum industry is over here, getting it out of the ground. Refining is either really good. Typically, in my career, about 1 year out of 5, refining would have a great year. The other years, they're saying, why don't we sell this business? Get rid of those guys. So anyway, that's kind of how your costs break down. So we're going to kind of look at vehicle trends, enough about fuels for right now. How efficient are cars? Why aren't they more efficient? And can efficiency make a difference? I mean, that's sort of the low-hanging fruit for them about vehicles. If we can make them more efficient, that's the first step to take, right? So here's EPA miles per gallon since 1975. The EPA publishes this data every year. It's a great data source. You can see something happened here. Remember I mentioned the CAFE law? This is the CAFE law. Drove it up, everybody met the targets, and then we just sat until mid-2000s, and now it started slowly creeping up again. So it's tempting to look at this and say, well, why didn't the auto companies do something? Okay? Well, the answer is they actually did. It's interesting. If you look here, we've got weight here, and we're looking at, this is fuel consumption, so lower is better. And notice if we normalize to weight, which is the big factor, these vehicles are much better in 2005 or whenever than they were in 1975. And notice also the triangles are diesels. Diesels are fundamentally more efficient, higher compression ratios. The diesel itself has about 15% more energy per volume. And here's our hybrid line. Hybrids make a big impact on fuel economy. So we've gotten better. Why did the mileage get better? Here we go. Blue curve is our fuel economy, miles per gallon. But look what's happened to weight. It's increased significantly over that time. Think SUVs, pickup trucks, we saw a lot more of those. But look at the horsepower curve. And I'm sorry, it's just in percent. So we actually, when the CAFE law first came, we dropped vehicle weight, we dropped horsepower, but since then it's been steadily climbing. And if we plotted 0 to 60 time, which my older slide did, it almost mimics this horsepower curve. And for the old guys in the room, this is something none of you know what. 1966 Pontiac GTO, Detroit big iron muscle car. That was the vehicle everybody wanted to have. Powerful, fast. A 0 to 60 time of 6.5 seconds, 9 miles per gallon. So what do you have to do to get a vehicle that's that fast today? A Camry V6, 5.7 seconds. Almost a second faster than the most iconic muscle car ever built. And gets 21 city, 30 highway miles per gallon. We've come a long way. But we've spent all that efficiency on more performance generally rather than fuel economy. Okay, why did we choose? Why did we make that choice? Why didn't we buy more fuel efficient vehicles? Okay, the next few slides are from a friend of mine, John German, who used to be at Honda. And he's really done a lot of great work on this. First, he said, let's look at real gasoline prices. And let's see, I think we're 1950 over here. And we're fairly steady, drop down. There's a big bump here. But in real prices, until about 2000, except for this bump, they really have stayed very low. So why would I want a car that doesn't burn as much gas? And even more dramatic is this plot he did. And this, he didn't look just at price. He looked at income. He looked at miles per gallon. He says, what's the real cost of driving a new vehicle 10,000 miles as a percent of a person's per capita disposable income? Back 75, almost 8% of my income, disposable income, would have gone to driving that car 10,000 miles. Right now, it's less than 4%. The real cost of driving has not gone up. We've moaned and groaned about gasoline prices, but in terms of our disposable income, it really hasn't changed that much, and it's actually gotten better. We make more money. vehicles get more miles per gallon, all those factors add in. So anyway, there's our cost. And he just did some, this is the Energy Information Administration's annual energy outlook projection for gasoline prices. He said, but if it went to $7.50 a gallon in 2025, we'd still be about where we are now. If it went to $14 a gallon, we'd be about where it was in 1975. So John's a really good analyst. The other thing John did was he looked and he said, what if in 1981, that's kind of where that curve just came up, started leveling off. If we had frozen weight, if we had frozen performance, 0 to 60 time, and we'd kept the same percentage of manual transmissions. And he says, instead of getting about 29 miles per gallon in the fleet, our fleet would now be getting almost 38 miles per gallon. It's a difference of about and this was in 2007, that's a difference of about 1.5 million barrels a day of petroleum. So if we had made the choice, instead of being bigger, faster, if we'd made the choice of fuel economy, we'd be saving a lot of oil just by that choice. And the auto companies did not force me to buy a big, fast vehicle. I made that choice. And they may have advertised it, they like to sell them because they're bigger profit margins, but in the end, I made that choice. Okay. So what's happening with efficiency? There are a lot of trends that are going on, have gone on. I won't go through them all, you can read them. These are technologies that have been implemented both for efficiency and also to reduce pollution. Injection, turbo downsizing means you, instead of a big, normally aspirated engine, you put a turbo on, you have a smaller engine, and you get the same power, okay? So turbo downsizing, hybridization, about lightweighting of the advanced materials. Lots of interesting transmission stuff going on right now. In 1975, you had either a 2 or 3 speed automatic. The average automatic sold in 2012 was almost 6. It was like 5.8 gears, but you can round that up to 6 gears. The average vehicle had about 6-gear automatic transmission. Lockup. Most automatic transmissions use a torque converter or fluid coupling that's inefficient. So you put in a lockup so that like at 45 miles an hour, you lock the torque converter out and you run more efficiently. And front wheel drive was a big factor too. And just to show you how those things penetrate, if you look from the first year of introduction in years, they actually, once they get started, they come on really quickly. As far as I know, you can't buy a carbureted vehicle today. They're all fuel injected. Variable valve timing has come on recently, multiple valves, front wheel drive, lockup, all those things are taken over because there's such a push, mostly from the government, for fuel economy, the new CAFE law. So there's our technology penetration rate. Here's just one, I just want to show you one example of how it evolves. This is fuel delivery. Here are our carburetors. This is what's called port fueling, is that port or throttle body? Okay, that's throttle body injection. That means you put it into the intake manifold. But here now we've gone to throttle body, you replace the carburetor. Here you spray it in the intake manifold. That's 5, 6, 7, and 8 with variable and fixed valve timing. And right now the hottest thing now is gasoline direct injection, where you inject fuel directly into the cylinder. All these aimed at increasing fuel economy. All right, moving forward, where are we going? The internal combustion engine has a lot of play left in it. There are a lot of things you can do to tweak engines to increase fuel economy, but we're moving forward and there are going to be different things going on. We'll talk mostly about the second two, maybe a little bit about the third one. Okay, as engineers, when you get out, one of the things you're going to be asked to do, they may call it different things, but you're going to be optimizing systems, all right? When that happens, what you find is there are a couple of things you have to do. First, you have to understand there are always going to be constraints on the system. For automobiles, there are technical constraints. The limits of the materials you're using, how hot a temperature a metal can stand. There are economic restrictions. You may be able to design the best vehicle in the world, but if it costs $150,000 a vehicle, it's a failure. Okay? Economic constraints. There are legal and political constraints. The CAFE law is a big constraint right now in car makers, and they're really scrambling to make sure they can meet it. Political constraints always. You saw this corn ethanol for vehicles is not an energy program, it's an ag subsidy program. Consumer choice. Consumers have to want that vehicle. Again, you can do everything technically you can, but if consumers don't like it, it's a failure. That may be the toughest one. So there are lots more you can name. Other thing is you need, and this is sometimes the tough thing, is an objective function. And I don't know if that's the right engineering term. I'm a chemist. But you need something that you want to maximize. You know, if it's maybe it's money, maybe it's miles per gallon, but you need an objective function to say, this is where we're shooting. You know, you need to have a clear target. I can't tell you how many times in my career we had projects fail within our company, and I'm ashamed to say, because we didn't have a good objective function when we started out. We just started out with this notion, if we can improve this, it'll be better. And that's not always the case. Okay, what's your objective function? Here's one for vehicles. This is real big with the Obama administration, reducing petroleum consumption. That's an important thing. Minimize greenhouse gas emissions. Very similar, but not identical. There's some subtle differences in these two that lead to very different vehicle choices very often. Minimize consumer cost. The phrase you often hear is TCO, total cost of ownership to consumer. The capital he spends up front to buy the vehicle and the fuel maintenance he uses. Providing jobs may be an incentive. We saw that a lot again in the ethanol industry. And if you're sitting in Washington, you want to get reelected. And that will drive a lot of these legal and political restrictions. It's what a politician, again, I'm old and cynical, but that's what drives a lot of our politicians, is let's do what I have to do to get reelected. I sat in the office with a senior Senate staffer for energy while we briefed him on what we were doing in the refining industry to try to provide clean fuels and all this. And he was a Democrat. He said, that's great. We understand what you're doing. We understand the problems. He said, but my boss, the senator, is still going to beat up on you. Don't worry about, that we're going to pass unreasonable laws, but we're going to really treat you bad in the media and we're going to be all over you. But we understand that that's just talk. Again, that makes you cynical sometimes. All right. What are our options for transportation? These are the most obvious I came up. We still continue our internal combustion engines, gasoline electric hybrids, both hybrids and plug-in hybrids, battery electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel cells. I've done a lot of work there, and I've also done a lot of work on biofuels with the internal combustion engine. There may be others, but this is the list I came up with. If your favorite's not there, apologize. Okay, we mentioned liquid fuels. Here's why we love liquid fuels. Energy density, both volumetric and gravimetric. Gasoline, 9.7, and this is kilowatt hours per liter. You could do BTUs per gallon, whatever you want, but the trends stay the same. Diesels, we said, is about 15% better. Ethanol, pretty not so great. Hydrogen at 10,000 psi is only about 1.3. Maybe it's better to look here. They're in percent of gasoline. Here's liquid hydrogen, a little better. Look at our batteries, though. These are the best liquid lithium metal and metal hydride batteries we can make. 2.1% of the energy density of gasoline volumetrically. If you look gravimetrically, it's a similar story, probably worse. Right now we're about 1% of gasoline in terms of the weight density. What does that mean? It means if I make a battery-powered vehicle, number one, if I want the same energy stored on that vehicle, I've got a huge battery instead of my gasoline tank. It's 50 times bigger to get the same energy. Unfortunately, EVs are more efficient, so you don't need the full storage, but you need a lot. And then also, it's going to take a lot of volume. Probably got to redesign my vehicle to find a place to put that battery if you want to put anything in the trunk, okay? So liquid fuels, that's why we love liquid fuels. They're great. If we hadn't found them, we'd be using some of this other stuff, but there's a lot to be said for liquid. So here are alternatives. We'll get through these pretty quickly here. Gasoline is cheap. We know you can refuel it quickly, great range, infrastructure, but we're using a limited resource, and we have mobile carbon dioxide emissions. Those are the two big cons, I say, with gasoline. Let's go into hybrids. Hybrid, really, we're going to talk about a gasoline engine with battery assist. and regen braking. So when we put on the brakes, we reverse the polarity on our motor and make it a generator. So we put energy back in the battery. We have dual drivetrains, which adds a little weight. I don't know if you're aware, but a Prius has maybe a 2 kilowatt hour battery. They only use about 200 of those 2,000 kilowatt hours. Because if you do deep discharge on that nickel metal hydride battery in a Prius, you really hurt the lifetime. So you're only using about 10% of the battery capacity on a Prius. Using the Atkinson cycle internal combustion engine, highly efficient, but not so great on power density. But these, as you saw on those curves, these are significantly more efficient. Great things, they efficiently use the gasoline. I've got, then if you're PHEV, we'll have more on those. They actually displace gasoline with the grid. We don't need any new infrastructure really for these. Reduced emissions. They're better in the city than on the highway. On the highway, you generally don't get the regenerative braking benefits, but they're expensive, the battery mainly. They're still using gasoline, mobile CO2. Again, not so great on the highway. So that's just a standard hybrid. The PHEVs, just like everything that was good about the hybrid's great, except now you're using a significant amount of grid electricity, so the gasoline displacement is very high. You use very little gasoline, and there's no range anxiety like you get with a battery vehicle. If you've got a PHEV, you run it all electric. When the battery runs out, it switches over to gasoline. Still does use gasoline though, mobile CO2. Battery is high cost, it's also high weight. It's a very high mass battery. I drive a PHEV, we'll talk about in a minute. The pure BEVs, this is the Leaf. Total electric drive, high energy, high power battery. We haven't talked about power, but as engineers, energy is how much energy there is, power is how fast it comes out. For this, all your power is coming from the battery, so it's got to be a full power battery. That adds to expense and somewhat to weight. Single powertrain, so you don't have the dual powertrains you had in the hybrid. If you've ever driven a battery electric vehicle, great torque, especially at the low end. Torque is what kind of pushes you back in the seat when you step on the gas, or the accelerator, we should say. Now, what are the pros? Total petroleum displacement. If we went back to that Lawrence Livermore slide of where the energy goes, almost no petroleum goes for electricity generation, a little bit. Zero emission, although I'd argue with that and say the emission is no longer in the vehicle, it's back at the power plant. You got performance, they are fun to drive. This, by the way, is a Tesla what I'd call a skateboard. This is all the battery pack here mounted down low. Gives you great low center of gravity, great handling. The cons are the cost. Right now, if you get the big Tesla, the 85 kilowatt hour battery, that battery alone costs $40,000. The target that Tesla's hoping with the giga plant or mega plant or whatever is to get from $500 down to about $250 per kilowatt hour battery. So that would bring it down to $21,000. Still, that's an expensive piece of gear that's replacing a gas tank that costs $60 or $70. Range anxiety is a big issue. Refueling is slow, even with the Tesla superchargers, and there's very limited infrastructure in terms of traveling long distances. Most people who buy Teslas are not buying them to take long trips. They're trying to do in-town driving. Okay, this is where we get back to this idea of displaced emissions. When you're driving a BEV or a PHEV, if you want to know how green your car is, you have to look at stuff like this. And we'll give you an example, but just see here, I've used 3 states, we'll use them again. California has a very green grid, lots of natural gas. West Virginia has lots of coal. Tennessee, kind of in the middle, at 1,100 pounds per megawatt hour. So all these, you got to take this into account. Also, and I won't get into this here because this gets really tough to try to figure out, the greenness of your vehicle may depend on what time of day you charge it. Because at peak load, all the utilities use natural gas for peaking. It's the most expensive fuel they use. So most of the time their base load will be hydro, nuclear, and coal. And you need renewables that come along because there's zero fuel cost. But when demand gets really high, they bring in natural gas. So if you charge at night, you're going to be using these, and depending on how much coal they have, it may be dirtier to charge at night than it is at peak load. Or it may be cleaner if they don't have much coal. California's probably cleaner. Anyway, it's not simple, that's the point. So here's the example. My Volt. I bought a Chevy Volt late last year. 80%, I do mostly in town, so 80%, 85% of my driving, I use grid electricity for power. And if you take the total number of miles I've driven and the gallons of gasoline I've used, that's a 228 mile per gallon vehicle. Incredible, right? Great. But what about greenhouse gas emissions? This is my example. You got to do the math. How much greenhouse gas does that vehicle emit compared to a standard vehicle? So what I did is, put together my spreadsheet. I said, okay, I'll convert that back, look at a gasoline vehicle and say, what's the equivalent miles per gallon for a gasoline vehicle to match the CO2 emissions for my car? Okay, Tennessee, for where I am, my greenhouse emissions are about like a 47 mile per gallon vehicle, which is pretty good. That's, Prius, maybe a little better than most Priuses do. If I were in California, it'd be like driving a 72 mile per gallon vehicle. And of course, West Virginia, it's equivalent to driving a 30 mile per gallon vehicle. So the greenness of this vehicle depends on how I get my electricity. And this is all made worse it's even more dependent for a battery vehicle. I'll show you a slide here coming up in a minute. We'll compare all these on one slide. It's a great slide. Hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, I do a ton of work. I've done for the last 10 years with the Department of Energy. You get very good petroleum displacement. It is, again, one of these zero-emission vehicles, but you get CO2 emissions when you produce hydrogen. Most hydrogen is made in the U.S. by steam reforming of methane. There are multiple routes, so almost any renewable you make, you can turn it into electricity and get hydrogen. It's expensive, though. I talked to a guy from GM. I was in Detroit last week, and I said, when are they coming? He said, the two big things we're fighting for fuel cell vehicles are, number one, the cost of the vehicle. Part of this is the fuel cell, the other is the tank for hydrogen, and the other is the lack of infrastructure. There are literally tens of stations in the U.S. for hydrogen fueling. California is getting ready to put about 25 in the next year with high subsidies. But range, you have to have a carbon fiber reinforced tank that's very expensive to store your hydrogen. Anyway, these vehicles, if you listen to Elon Musk, who builds a Tesla, he says these are total crap. We'll never do it. It's awful. If you listen to Toyota will say the same thing about Elon Musk's Tesla. There's a battle right now for future vehicles. Is it going to be battery? Is it going to be hydrogen fuel cell? The big thing hydrogen fuel cell has going for it, if we eliminate everything else, you fuel it just like you fuel a gasoline vehicle. I've fueled them in California. With a Tesla, even with a supercharger, you're talking about, 30 minutes for a fast charge. It brings you up to half capacity on your battery. Then you have to slow down because you'll damage the battery. So anyway, refueling time is the big bugaboo for BEVs. Okay, here's my great slide. John Haywood at MIT put this slide together. It's a study. Okay. I thought I had the reference on there. I apologize. Study called On the Road 2035. And what he's looking at here, he's looking at gasoline consumption. Okay, how much gasoline does this vehicle use? And here he's looking at greenhouse gas emissions. And he's projecting 2035 vehicles. So up the top there's our spark ignition vehicle. If we put a turbo on that, we can cut both greenhouse emissions and petroleum consumption. Diesel does a little better. Here's our gasoline hybrid. Wow, we've made a huge impact on both. We come down and see this is, I think this is grams per mile or per kilometer or something. We made a huge impact. Notice what happens when we go to plug-in hybrid, though. Now we don't have a point, we have a line. And what it says, if we use the average grid mix, this is about as good as a regular hybrid. Remember my Volt, 47 miles per gallon? What's a Prius? About 48. Exactly what John Haywood said. If we use natural gas, it's cleaner. If we use coal, it's dirtier. If we go to fuel cell vehicle, that's this purple square right here. Now if we look at a pure BEV, a battery vehicle, again we got a line. Here's average grid mix over here. It's worse than our hybrid. If we have natural gas, it's just about as good as a hybrid. If we charge that thing on coal electricity, it's worse than our spark ignition. Remember, it's worse than the gasoline engine if we're charging with coal. And and there are some people who would make the argument that a lot of these vehicles are charged exclusively on coal. If you think about marginal generation at night for a lot of utilities, that's all coal. All right, here's the other one in John's slides that I really like. He went in the study on the road 2035. He says, okay, let's look at how much, this is total petroleum usage. He said, here's the way it's kind of progressed over the last few years. 2010 is right there. He says, okay, what's going to happen in the future? You see that big blue wedge up there? That is if we changed our minds. And instead of insisting on bigger, heavier, faster vehicles, we only insisted on that half as much. In other words, we said, we'll let them get half bigger, we'll let them get more powerful, but only half as fast as they've increased in the past. A huge difference there. Here's turbos, diesels, hybrids, plug-ins, and then here's if we went all the way and said, we're going to freeze vehicle weight and performance. And the point of this chart is you can talk a lot about technology, and that kind of middle wedge is all the technology. But the big wedge is what you and I choose. What vehicle are we going to buy? That makes more impact than any of these technologies do. Now, and you can see the penetrations here. He's used some pretty aggressive penetration rates to get to 2035 with those populations of vehicles. But the big decider of how much petroleum we use is going to be the choices we make, okay? And that report is online. So, okay, we're almost done. A few words about biofuels. We're using now soy biodiesel and corn ethanol. I'm going to go through these pretty quick. The next generation cellulosic ethanol and hydrocarbons. This is a renewable fuel standard that actually says by law you got to produce this much fuel. What's happened this year, though, we were supposed to be in 2014 producing 1.7 billion gallons of cellulosic biofuel. The EPA said we can't do that. We're going to lower the requirement to 17 million. That's by a factor of 100. We're missing that target. The reason is you can't make it and make money. Okay. Here are our principal biofuels: corn ethanol, soy biodiesel, tallow diesel. These are the new ones. Corn ethanol is what we see mostly. We had about 15 billion gallons of capacity. It's only about 25% energy positive. If we take away the byproduct credit for dried distiller's grain, it's only about 10% positive. If you do it in the Midwest, it's positive. If you do it in Georgia, it's actually a negative energy balance. That's how sensitive this is. High nitrogen use, and again, the greenhouse gases are lower. So, and I'm not going to talk about RINs. We're running up against the blend wall. In other words, every bit of gasoline sold in the U.S. today now is about E10. The renewable fuel industry wants to get more in. They want to start either sell more E85 or start blending E15, E10. There's some positive things about that, but the problem is old vehicles don't like E15 and E20, we found. So there's a problem of liability. Who's going to take the liability? Cellulosic fuels have great potential. They're hard to convert, though. There are a lot of nice feedstocks we can use, but again, it's hard to convert them, hard to make money. This is low carbon footprint. You can do marginal land that's not suitable for crops, domestic, local economic stimulus. Here are the negatives. Range fuels and Kior have both been each $200 or $300 million businesses that went bankrupt. There are real economy of scale issues. As an engineer, you want that scaling law. The bigger you build it, the cheaper it is. But the problem is the energy content of the fuel has to be greater than the energy you use to transport that corn stove or whatever it is to your processing plant. And it takes, depending on who you believe, maybe 50 kilometers is the maximum you can take. So you're limited to a plant that has a 50-kilometer radius of feedstock, and that limits the size of your plant. Economics are different. I'm going to talk about soy biodiesel. Europe finally passed laws. We were spending $300 million a year to subsidize European drivers, though, before the EU took action against us. If you've got a diesel, I wouldn't use anything more than B5 in it. If you don't have, don't worry about it. And the greenhouse gases all over the place. Michael Wong with a Greek model says you have 30 grams of CO2 per megajoule. Mark DeLucchi out at UC Davis says, no, it's 300. So there's some dispute about how much greenhouse gas you produce. Tallow renewable diesel, we've done at ConocoPhillips. We quit doing it because the biodiesel lobby took away our subsidy, so we quit doing it. Couldn't make money. And the interesting factor is you want to know, 3 cows is about a barrel. You take the fat when you render them. Algae is a big promise, but right now it's way too expensive. I work on the steering committee for the Bioenergy Technology Office. Real cost right now about $18 a gallon, gasoline gallon equivalent for fuel made from algae. Okay, skip over this. Okay, this is where let's end up here. First of all, what can you do? What can I do? We can look at our vehicle choice. I didn't talk about any about behavior, but we can look at how we travel. Is that trip really necessary? For city planning, cities need to be planned where people don't spend as much time sitting there with a car with motor idling. Public transport is very important if we can get people to use that. In our homes, where do you want to live? I mean, it's great if you say I want to live way out in the country, but then you got that commute you're going to have to pay for it. The first thing I tell my children is don't build a lifestyle based on cheap energy. Insulation in your home. You talk about the cost of reducing greenhouse gases. This actually pays off. It has a negative cost. If you put more insulation in your house, you use less energy. You reduce greenhouse gases. The size of your house is a big deal. Policies, carbon tax, cap and trade, fee baits. We talk about an imported oil tax would help. Now, this is almost done. If I were king, what would I do? If I were in charge, first thing I'd implement a cost of carbon. If we really believe climate change is serious, we can't expect for-profit businesses to act on that when it's just an externality. It has to be made internal. There has to be a cost to that carbon. Every corporation, 10 years ago, my corporation, if you wanted to get a new project, you had to go in and say, okay, here's the profitability at $20 a ton CO2, here's the profitability at $40 a ton. We're anticipating this, but government hasn't acted. Cap and trade is, if you're an economist, you can link into that, a carbon tax. Fee baits, the idea that if you want to buy a gas guzzler, I don't believe in limiting people's choices. If you want to buy a big honking Ford Expedition and weight it down to accessories, that's fine. But you ought to pay a fee up front that takes into account the cost of that vehicle on the environment. The idea of a fee bait is then you take that money and use it to help people buy fuel-efficient vehicles. Big thing politically, the T word, taxes, does not appear here. You can make this revenue neutral. Okay, and use those revenues to look at sustainable energy and transportation. We need to electrify the light-duty fleet, save those liquid fuels for aviation. There's nothing that can replace a liquid fuel for aviation. Okay, finally revamp the rail system. When I grew up in a little town in Alabama, we had a freight train that came in every day and unloaded freight for local delivery with the final mile on the truck. You don't see that anymore. Our freight's all going by truck. Greenhouse emissions are about a third by rail per ton of what a truck has, less NOx emissions. And then finally, that may, if we rebuild those tracks, there are tracks in the U.S. where you can't go over 10 miles an hour in a train. Get those tracks back in shape, we can start thinking about fast rail. Okay, I'm going to leave this talk with the guys in the department, but there are a lot of good, when I first started doing this, it was hard to find the information. It's not anymore. They're great sources. Climate assessment, all these things. If you have any questions, send me an email. Okay, take-home messages, and we're done. First one is go back to that first slide where they show the curve of lifestyle versus energy. The good life doesn't require as much energy as we're using now. Okay. Second one is we've made a choice for fuel-inefficient vehicles. Okay, those have made a difference. Remember, I showed you 1.5 million barrels a day that we would be saving if we hadn't made these choices. Second, they aren't as simple as some people have us believe. You have to do the math. And finally, everybody's trying to make a buck, and that's not a bad thing. I don't think any of the faculty here work for free. But remember that. When people are telling you something's great, when I was working, if somebody came to me and said, we want to save the world, I kind of made sure my wallet was still in my pocket. If somebody comes in and says, we got a great money-making idea that's going to help, that's going to have great environmental benefits as well, I'm ready to talk. But for whatever reason, or for anything that's not government mandated, it has to make money. That's a fact. Just realize that, and that the biofuels folks are just as greedy as the petroleum folks. Maybe more. So that's it. Ran longer than I hoped to, but might have time for a few questions.
Any questions? Okay, 4 minutes, Keith. You've got a question over there. What's the question?
Yeah. What? They're less polluting. Turns out gasoline is a very complex liquid, but there are ways to reformulate it to take certain components out that make it less polluting. So you basically change your mixture a little bit, but that costs money. You have to take some of the cheap stuff out. Yeah. 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 No, I mean, it's just, it's not really a question of how efficient solar is. The point is, there's very little solar out there, and they need a lot of incentives for people to buy solar. That's the bottom line. So you have to subsidize solar energy a lot if you're going to get people to buy it. That's not a problem. Remember I talked about that huge depreciated infrastructure. To compete against that, you got to have some help. Now, if we get back on that chart where now solar's a big, huge bar going across there, the world has changed and you need to take away those subsidies. You don't subsidize fuels in perpetuity. And I have no problem with doing away with every subsidy petroleum gets. It won't affect the industry. It'll make them a little less profitable. But subsidies in the energy field should be for new technologies that are not yet developed enough to compete against this huge, totally depreciated infrastructure that exists. Once you kind of get to a certain threshold, and they're doing this in Germany now with solar, the solar subsidies in Germany are dropping the feedback tariffs, right, every year. And they've got a huge solar resource. Well, they've got a terrible resource. They've got a lot of solar panels. There's not a lot of sun in Germany. But what they're doing is what any market should do. They've given them that leg up, and now they're saying, now you're a big boy, pull up your pants and compete on your own. And that's what has to happen. When you look at the numbers for energy, the government cannot afford to subsidize energy in any major way. It's just too much money. So, thanks for coming. I'm sorry I went so long.